Troy, the city everyone assumed was a myth, until someone actually went looking for over 2,000 years. The world's greatest scholars agreed on one thing about Troy: it never existed. It was a story, Homer's fiction, a setting for gods and heroes with no basis in actual geography or history. Then a wealthy, obsessive businessman with no formal archaeological training ignored every expert who told him he was wasting his life, started digging in the exact spot he believed the story described, and found an actual city underneath. The city of Troy, and the specific war fought there according to Homer's ancient Greek epic poem, the Iliad, composed sometime around the 8th century BC, but describing events the poem itself situates centuries earlier, occupied a genuinely unusual position within European intellectual and historical tradition for well over 2,000 years. Treated by virtually the entire educated world as foundational cultural mythology, a story understood to hold genuine literary, philosophical, and cultural significance, but one that the overwhelming scholarly consensus regarded as pure literary invention rather than any kind of accurate historical or geographical record, since no physical evidence had ever been definitively located, confirming the city's actual existence at any specific real-world location. This scholarly consensus began to genuinely, seriously shift due to the efforts of Heinrich Schliemann, a wealthy German businessman who had made his considerable fortune through international trade, before dedicating the latter portion of his life to what most professional archaeologists and classical scholars of his era regarded as a genuinely quixotic amateur pursuit, personally funding and leading excavation efforts specifically intended to locate the actual physical site of Troy, working from his own close reading of Homer's specific geographical descriptions within the Iliad itself, along with earlier speculative work by British archaeologist Frank Calvert, who had previously proposed a specific mound in northwestern Turkey, known locally as Hisarlik, as a plausible candidate location, though Calvert himself had lacked the substantial personal financial resources necessary to conduct extensive excavation. Schliemann began major excavation work at hisarlik in 1871, and his efforts over the following years revealed something genuinely historically significant: not a single ancient city, but an extensive, complex archaeological site containing the physical remains of multiple successive settlements, constructed, destroyed, and rebuilt directly atop one another across an extraordinarily long span of historical time, with modern archaeological analysis eventually identifying at least 9 distinct major settlement layers at the site, spanning roughly from the early Bronze Age through the Roman and Byzantine periods, representing a genuinely remarkable, continuous, if repeatedly interrupted, history of human habitation at this specific strategic location for well over 3,000 years. Schliemann's specific excavation methods, evaluated by later, more methodologically rigorous generations of professional archaeologists, have been extensively, genuinely criticized as having caused considerable irreversible damage to the site itself. Since Schliemann, in his eagerness to locate what he specifically believed represented the historical Troy described in Homer's poem, employed excavation techniques involving extensive use of explosives and large-scale earth removal that modern archaeologists studying the site's history generally agree destroyed or severely damaged archaeological evidence from several of the site's distinct historical layers, ironically including, according to later, more careful archaeological analysis, likely damaging or destroying at least some physical evidence from the specific layer modern scholars now consider the most probable candidate for the actual historical period Homer's poem may have originally described. Schliemann's excavations did produce one genuinely spectacular, internationally famous discovery, a substantial cache of gold and precious metal artifacts he personally identified and publicly promoted as Priam's treasure, directly connecting the find to the specific legendary Trojan king described in Homer's poem, a dramatic, genuinely compelling claim that generated enormous international public attention and excitement at the time. Though modern archaeological analysis has subsequently determined the treasure actually dates from a considerably earlier historical period than the Trojan War's traditionally estimated time frame, meaning Schliemann's specific identification of the treasure's connection to Homer's priam was almost certainly historically inaccurate, even though the artifacts themselves remain genuinely significant, valuable archaeological evidence of the site's broader, extensive Bronze Age habitation. What makes hisarlik's identification as the genuine historical site of Troy genuinely scientifically significant, beyond Schliemann's own dramatic, occasionally historically inaccurate personal claims, is that subsequent generations of professional archaeologists, employing considerably more careful, methodologically rigorous excavation techniques than Schliemann's original efforts, have continued studying the site extensively since his initial work, ultimately identifying a specific settlement layer, generally designated Troy 7 by archaeologists studying the site's chronological sequence, that shows genuine, credible physical evidence of violent destruction occurring at approximately the correct historical period. Modern chronological estimates suggest for the traditional Trojan War, including archaeological evidence of fire damage, weapons, and other indicators consistent with a genuine, historical military conflict occurring at the site during this specific time frame. This doesn't definitively prove that the specific narrative details described in Homer's poem, the individual heroes, the 10-year siege, the wooden horse, occurred precisely as described in what remains, regardless of any underlying historical basis, a work of literary epic poetry rather than a strict historical record. But it does provide genuine, credible archaeological evidence that some form of significant violent conflict genuinely occurred at this specific site during approximately the correct historical period, offering meaningful, if inherently limited, support for the broader theory that Homer's epic poem may have preserved some genuine historical memory of an actual historical conflict, however extensively embellished and reshaped through centuries of oral tradition, before eventually being formally composed into the specific literary work that has survived to the present day. Modern archaeological work at the site, continuing actively into recent decades under considerably more methodologically careful international research teams than Schliemann's original efforts, has continued revealing additional significant details regarding the site's extensive, complex, multi-layered history, including evidence suggesting the settlement's later periods achieved genuinely considerable size and strategic significance, consistent with the kind of prominent, historically significant city that could plausibly have inspired the kind of enduring cultural and literary significance Homer's poem eventually attached to it. What makes Troy's rediscovery endure as one of history's most significant archaeological achievements isn't simply the genuine historical and archaeological value the site itself has provided, considerable as that value genuinely remains, but the specific, remarkable demonstration the case provided regarding exactly how thoroughly an amateur enthusiast's stubborn, methodologically flawed but ultimately correct conviction could overturn centuries of confident, established scholarly consensus, transforming what generations of educated scholars had confidently dismissed as pure literary myth into a genuine, physically verified archaeological site, even while the specific excavation methods that achieved this genuine breakthrough simultaneously destroyed archaeological evidence that more careful, patient methodology might have preserved for considerably more definitive future study. If stories like this, where an outsider's stubborn conviction proved centuries of expert consensus wrong, even while making genuine, costly mistakes along the way, are exactly what you come here for, subscribe to The Grave Details, because history holds more stories like this than most people will ever know.